Two sisters, two queens. At first glance, Henry VIII's daughters couldn't be more different. One deeply steeped in traditional Catholicism, the product of a stable marriage. The other Protestant, born from a great upheaval. Add to that their half-brother, often called the spoiled son, and the 9-year-old King of England, Edward VI. Why did the seemingly sacred sisterly bond turn into a confrontation filled with tears and blood? Among them, who paid the highest price? Henry VIII. The most brutal king, ready to behead 2 wives and break with the Pope for a single obsession. He had to have a male heir to ensure the survival of the Tudor dynasty. But this very thirst for power and heir sowed the seeds for a little-known tragedy, the toxic relationship between his own flesh and blood children. Henry VIII pushed Mary into humiliation by being cast aside and later stripped Elizabeth of her status, leading to Edward's fierce attempt to remove both sisters from the throne. Their lives were full of conflict and confrontation. Could siblings forged in the fires of their father's ambition survive that treacherous path, and who would pay the highest price? As a child, Mary was Henry VIII's only hope after many years of waiting for an heir. She was raised with extraordinary care like a true princess. Her mother, Catherine of Aragon, was a profoundly learned woman who wanted her daughter to receive a comprehensive education like a monarch. This excellent education made Mary believe she was as intelligent and capable as any man. But Mary's fate changed forever when her father, Henry VIII, became obsessed with having a son and enamored with Anne Boleyn. Henry believed his marriage to Catherine was cursed and wanted to declare it invalid. Catherine adamantly refused to divorce, and the Pope disagreed, pulling Mary into this war. To force Catherine to yield, Henry imposed incredible cruelty, forbidding Mary from seeing her mother unless both recognized Henry's new marriage. This was a heartbreaking, deeply humiliating, and extremely difficult period for teenage Mary. She was frequently ill and mentally collapsed as her father tried to declare her illegitimate. This cruel act shaped Mary's character later in life. The birth of Elizabeth on September 7, 1533, was not a joy for Mary. On the contrary, it was the beginning of a new phase of humiliation. Mary was rejected, forgotten by Henry, stripped of her title as Princess of Wales and all symbols of status. The most horrifying thing was that Mary was forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting in the household of her newborn sister Elizabeth. There was constant pressure on teenage Mary to admit she was illegitimate and recognize Anne as queen and Elizabeth as heir. It was a miserable time for Mary. The turbulent life in Henry VIII's court continued. On January 7, 1536, Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, died. To the end of her life, Catherine firmly refused to recognize Henry's new marriage. Henry's cruelty to Mary did not stop even after her mother died. He refused to allow Mary to attend her mother's funeral. It was an astonishingly cruel act from a father. For Henry, he demanded absolute obedience. At court, the king and queen, Anne Boleyn, celebrated Catherine's death. But Anne's victory was short-lived. Just months later, she fell out of favor and lost power. Anne Boleyn was accused of incest, adultery, and treason, charges often believed to be fabricated so Henry could get rid of her. Finally, Anne was executed. This swift and tragic downfall showed the ephemerality and danger of power in Henry VIII's court. Anne fell primarily because she failed to give Henry a son. Around this time, Mary finally yielded. Still grieving her mother's death, she longed to regain her father's love and feared what he might do to her. Mary finally had to recognize Henry as the head of the Church of England and herself as illegitimate. Mary regretted this painful concession for the rest of her life. The reward for her sacrifice was very small. She was allowed to return to court, but the new act of succession did not restore Mary as heir. Instead, it stripped her infant sister Elizabeth of her title and status. And then, in the autumn of 1537, the child came. Henry finally got what he had longed for. A son, Edward. Henry was overjoyed. For him, his 2 daughters seemed forgotten, no longer important. The entire court revolved around Edward. Ironically, Edward's birth was perhaps the best thing that happened to Elizabeth and Mary, as it reduced pressure on both. Edward's birth was an unexpected bond for the 2 sisters. They now shared the status of illegitimate children, as Henry saw it, and a younger brother. Everyone assumed this meant neither sister would ever become queen. Elizabeth began receiving a better education and later lived with Edward, receiving an excellent education. Mary was also invited back to court more often and gradually reconnected with her father. However, Jane Seymour died not long after Edward's birth. 3 more wives would come and go, but Henry had no more children. For the rest of their father's life, Mary and Elizabeth shared the same precarious status. Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547. Henry's 2 daughters, though still officially illegitimate, were restored to the line of succession, but first would be their young brother, Edward. Edward ascended the throne at a very young age, just 9 years old. His reign was entirely dominated by regents and manipulative, powerful men. They pushed the country in a strongly Protestant direction. Edward himself was a very fervent Protestant. Edward VI's reign was a difficult time for the 2 sisters. Mary, deeply steeped in the Catholic faith, frequently clashed intensely with her brother's government over religious reforms. She refused the new prayer book in English, and her household maintained the traditions of the old religion. She and the council, representing Edward, constantly argued over her right to celebrate the Catholic Mass in her private home. Edward, in his position as king, said, "You shall obey me, I am king." And Mary replied, "You are my younger brother. I certainly do not take orders from you." They had fierce arguments. A terrible Christmas Eve is remembered when they stood arguing before the entire court, and both wept over the religious issue. Mary did not believe in what Edward was doing, and Edward thought Mary's Catholic Mass was wrong. Edward VI's reign was short. In early 1553, the boy became seriously ill. Edward was fully aware that Mary was waiting to ascend the throne and intended to restore Catholicism. All the effort to build the Protestant church would be immediately undone. Edward did not have time to pass the act through Parliament because he was too weak. So, in April before his death, he wrote his device for the succession, removing both sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, from the line of inheritance. He changed the line of succession to his distant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant, who married the powerful regent's son. Placing Lady Jane Grey on the throne was effectively a Protestant coup. Edward VI died on July 6, 1553, just 15 years old. His death was kept secret for days by the government to implement the succession plan. News of the king's death spread. From her vast estates, Mary began to gather troops. England was on the brink of civil war. About 3 days before Edward died, Mary was on her way to court to visit her brother, believing he had recovered from his illness. She did not know it was a trap. They underestimated Mary. She received timely warning from a supporter, "Don't come. There is a plan, basically, to arrest you." This was a rare stroke of luck in Mary's eventful life. A supporter rode non-stop all night to inform her that she was the Queen of England. Mary immediately turned back and began mobilizing troops. This was an area where Mary had tremendous support. She believed this was her chance. God had protected her throughout her life to sit on the throne and restore Catholicism. This was entirely Mary's divine mission. Mary was completely determined and ready to fight for the throne if necessary. That was the characteristic, stubborn, obstinate attitude of the Tudor lineage. On July 10th, Edward's council, led by the ambitious Duke of Northumberland, proclaimed Lady Jane Queen of England. The council seemed to hold all the advantages. Northumberland set about gathering forces to arrest Edward's 2 sisters, Mary and Elizabeth. However, as soon as Northumberland left, many began to doubt the feasibility of the plan. When Lady Jane was proclaimed queen, a stony silence fell over London. It was a strange experience. No one cheered for Queen Jane. The people saw her as a usurper, albeit an unwilling one. They wanted Henry VIII's daughter as queen. The one worthy of sitting on the throne was Mary. There was no civil war, no armed conflict at all. As a frightened Lady Jane waited in the Tower of London, people across the country declared their loyalty to Mary. Even Northumberland himself was soon forced to face the inevitable. 6 days after leaving London to arrest Mary, he recognized her as queen. Immediately, Mary proceeded to London to begin her reign. Her sister Elizabeth was in a precarious position. She was Mary's heir. Elizabeth could be an ally or a threat. In early August, Elizabeth met her sister outside London. With her was an entourage of 1,000 horsemen in splendid uniforms. It was a declaration of support for Mary, but also a reminder of Elizabeth's own status and power. Together, the two sisters rode into London. Mary entered, looking completely worthy of the Queen's position. She wore royal purple, resplendent with jewellery. She presented herself in the most spectacular way so that everyone immediately understood that she was the centre of attention. Mary lacked stage presence. She was awkward and shy. Nevertheless, it was a magnificent sight when this rightful queen, who would restore unity and peace, rode into London, followed by her tall, now strangely ethereally beautiful sister, Elizabeth. Both Mary and Elizabeth were acutely aware that they were Henry's daughters. There was a real sense of Tudor legitimacy flowing in their veins. This was a display of unity, and that was its purpose, to show off the strength of the Tudor dynasty. But there was much simmering beneath the surface. Elizabeth, above all, was a politician. She wanted political influence for herself and to protect her own interests, and she knew the best way was to support her sister. Mary was crowned on October 1st. She began her reign the way she intended it to continue. It was a Catholic ceremony. She made it clear from the start that she wanted England to forget its brief time as a Protestant nation and return to being a Catholic country. When she ascended the throne, the Catholic Mass was still illegal. Mary Tudor's primary obsession was to restore the Catholic faith to England, and that goal dominated her entire political life and foreign policy. England was now a Catholic nation, and everyone had to comply with that. If you didn't comply, you would be punished. Mary went down in history by the name Bloody Mary. She sent many hundreds of Protestants to the stake. What is remarkable about Mary's reign is the brutality of the burnings. In just a few short years, 287 men, women, and children were burned. Mary genuinely thought that a few people would be enough to set an example for others. There was a belief in the 16th century that if you allowed a heretic to live, you would be damned along with them. So Mary felt responsible and obligated to remove these heretics from England. For the Catholic faith to be permanently restored in England, Mary needed children. To have children, she needed a husband. Her choice astonished her advisors and the entire nation. It was Prince Philip of Spain. Mary was always in a difficult position when choosing a husband. She couldn't easily marry an English subject, and if she married a foreign prince, she would essentially place England in the hands of a foreign power. Mary wanted to create a great dynasty just like her mother, the Spanish princess, remarrying Spain and creating unity as her parents had. A very favorable marriage treaty was drafted, stating that Philip would have very little role in the government. However, many feared that a marriage to Spain would mean England would be swallowed into the Spanish Empire. Poor Mary never grasped this truth. She didn't understand the importance in the eyes of her subjects that foreigners should not rule England. The horror of England having to submit to a Catholic nation, a very powerful foreign power that was too much to bear. A plot was formed to overthrow Mary from the throne and replace her with her sister Elizabeth. Led by Sir Thomas Wyatt, it was a group of very determined Protestants. Wyatt gathered 2,000 to 3,000 people ready to fight for Elizabeth. The rebellion failed and the leaders were publicly executed. The rebellion might have only briefly threatened Mary's power, but its failure was a much more serious threat to Elizabeth. Many suspected Elizabeth was involved in the plot. She was in a very awkward position. She was the symbol that the more radical Protestants would use against Mary. She constantly and vehemently protested her innocence when questioned by the Privy Council. The most tense moment: Elizabeth was taken to the Tower of London. She was imprisoned in the same apartments her mother, Anne Boleyn, had occupied before her execution. She knew a thin hair's breadth separated her from a similar fate. Mary's advisors had drafted an order for Elizabeth's execution. It is said that Mary very nearly signed it. Her hand was on the order when she suddenly changed her mind. Perhaps she had an attack of conscience. Mary spared her sister's life. Perhaps she was moved by Elizabeth's letter begging for forgiveness, or perhaps Mary did not want to cause further division in the country. Instead, she imprisoned Elizabeth for several months before releasing her. In any case, Mary had more pressing problems to deal with. By the end of 1554, Catholic doctrine reappeared in English churches, and anti-heresy laws returned, allowing the trial and execution of Protestants. In late 1554, Mary became pregnant, or she thought so. The following spring, she summoned Elizabeth to court to witness the birth. It was the child who would replace Elizabeth in the line of succession and affirm England as a Catholic nation. Everything seemed to be going Mary's way. It was a moment of profound distress for Elizabeth and all Protestants. But of course, things did not go according to plan. The supposed pregnancy turned out to be a phantom pregnancy. The waiting was prolonged, and everyone at court waited for the due date, but no baby arrived. Mary then had to step out of her bedroom and face the humiliation of saying, "Oh, I'm actually not pregnant." The entire nation of England and all of Europe had held their breath waiting for the announcement of the heir. Mary was never in good health. It's very likely that Mary suffered from ovarian cancer later in life. This explains her abdominal swelling, which was mistaken for pregnancy. Poor Mary was humiliated and suffering, and Elizabeth, well, she was back in the game. The phantom pregnancy changed everything. Mary's Spanish husband Philip withdrew. He left England and only returned for a short time, a few months before Mary died. That truly marked the end of their marriage, which was very painful for Mary. It was clear to everyone but Mary herself that he did not love her and was bored with her. Mary adored Philip. She was obsessed with him, but her affection was not reciprocated. He waited for the baby, and when he found out there was none, he was quite angry, embarrassed, and returned to Spain. So, Mary was doubly humiliated. This wasn't Mary's only failure. She had hoped a Catholic England would be welcomed back into the fold of Rome. Instead, the country became increasingly isolated. The Habsburg Wars had made Mary's husband, Philip, an enemy of the Pope. Mary's dream of England united with Rome was shattered. She was approaching 40, childless, and her husband was absent. The future of England seemed decided. It would be the Protestant Elizabeth who ascended the throne. Mary began to decline physically and mentally. By mid-1558, her poor health was widely known. Her judgment could be seen to deteriorate. She could not reconcile people with different views. She began to lose control. The country did not like a weak, sickly monarch. They felt it as a judgment upon themselves. And because they thought she was dying, it meant people began to think perhaps it was time to shift allegiance to Elizabeth. Mary could even see this happening. People looked towards the rising sun rather than the setting sun. So, courtiers began moving to Hatfield, trying to curry favor with the expected new monarch. Elizabeth had a growing number of courtiers. She was gathering supporters around her. Just 5 years after her triumphant entry into London, Mary died on November 17th, 1558. Elizabeth was well prepared. It was the most peaceful transfer of power in over a century that England had witnessed. Elizabeth would reign for the next 45 years. Interestingly, although Mary and Elizabeth had a volatile relationship, shaped by their father's ambition, deep faith differences, and the struggle for survival, Elizabeth's reign inherited much from the foundation Mary laid. Important works like financial reform, naval development, all were started by Mary. It was Mary who first shaped female sovereignty, speaking of a queen as the mother of the nation. Mary passed an act stating that a queen regnant had all the power of a king. Elizabeth benefited from that. She had power and authority because her sister had been there and established what a queen regnant could and could not do. Both showed that a woman could do the job of a monarch as well as a man, and they were equally intelligent, open to political scheming and political deception. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and contribute to support us.